Malcolm Campbell is a professor of history at the University of Auckland in New Zealand. He is specialized in diverse areas of expertise, such as Irish and Australian history and the history of migration. He has an international reputation as a leading scholar in the comparative study of Irish immigration and settlement. He has been a visiting professor in many universities.
His most recent book is Ireland's Farthest Shores: Mobility, Migration and Settlement in the Pacific World, published in 2022. Today, Professor Malcolm Campbell will examine Irish diasporic identities in the Pacific World, in which he highlights the relationship between the Pacific world and Ireland starting from the late 18th century, and also the process of immigration and settlement that reached its peak during the mid-19th century.
Malcolm Campbell is a professor of history at the University of Auckland. He received his PhD history from the University of New South Wales in Australia. After completing his PhD, a regional study of Irish immigration and settlement in 19th century in Australia, his research broadened to encompass the global dimensions of Irish immigration in the century after 1815. One of his books is named Ireland, New Worlds, which discusses about immigrants, politics and society in the United States and Australia from 1815 to 1922. Today, he will discuss Irish diasporic identities in the Pacific world, explaining the Irish migration to the Pacific, his evolution and his interactions with the natives, highlighting the difficulties relative to the climate challenges.
It's wonderful to be participating in the conference. I only regret that I'm not there in person with all of you. I wanted to start by thanking the students for that wonderful introduction, and also to thank Naomi for the invitation to participate in the conference and for all the work that she has put in. Also thanks to Philippe Valla, who has translated my paper, and I hope that that's available to people who need it. It was very exciting to attend the conference yesterday. From Louis' opening comments, which emphasised personal and ongoing connections with the Pacific right through the day, and the range of interesting papers that were connected by that sense of connection with the Pacific and its enduring connection right up to today, affecting a wide range of groups of people. And it seemed to me that that's one of the, if not the critical issue facing Irish diaspora studies today, is the way that we take account of the large numbers of people in the Pacific and also in other areas of the world, such as Asia and the Caribbean, who have Irish ancestry. And I'd like to talk about the Irish in the Pacific today, and then lead on to some reflections about the present, and then take questions. So as I said, it's just a wonderful honour to participate in this conference. In 1994, in an American television documentary entitled Out of Ireland, the late Irish folklorist and musician Mick Maloney recalled his emotions on arriving for the first time in California at the Pacific coastline. I'll never forget when my toes touched the Pacific, thinking how far away from Ireland I was. The further from Ireland I go and find Irish people, it's out there I find the restless ones. Maloney's comment represented an important break from the concentration on the Atlantic world that long characterised the study of Irish emigration and settlement, and provided a rare moment of recognition for the Irish presence in the Pacific, the largest of the world's oceanic spaces. 30 years later, this conference represents a further step in the recognition of the past and present diversity of Celtic connections with the Pacific world. Understood to mean not only the Anglophone societies on its eastern and western shores, but also the diverse lands and populations that together make up this oceanic space. In this conference presentation, I aim to explore the history of Irish people's engagement with the Pacific world, suggesting the ways Irish identities influence the modern history of this vast space, as well as the ways the lands and waters of the Pacific Ocean touch the lives and aspirations of the Irish people who travelled far from home to live there. Ireland's connections with the Pacific are long and extensive. and I'll deal with them only briefly. Close ties between the early modern Spanish court and Irish exiles in Spain ensured that from the time of Ferdinand Magellan's journey into the Pacific in 1519, a small number of Irishmen participated in the early European voyages of exploration. Historians of the Trans-Pacific voyage now estimate that Spaniards comprised only about 2/3 of the crew on Magellan's multi-ethnic, multilingual fleet. The remainder was a mixture of seamen drawn hastily from the coastal communities of the Mediterranean and also from Northern and Western Europe. Despite the failure of 8 subsequent fleets to replicate Magellan's remarkable achievement, a flourishing trans-Pacific trade eventually developed between Acapulco and Manila that profoundly influenced the emergence of the early modern global economy. We know Irishmen participated in this extensive trade, though the numbers and backgrounds of the mariners remains elusive. In 1709, Edward Cook, in his journal kept aboard the Englishman Wood Rogers' private English expedition to seize Spanish galleons on the Manila-Acapulco run, wrote that the privateers had successfully raided and taken command of a small Spanish frigate before they encountered its companion ship, a larger and much better armed ship, Nuestra Senora de Begoña. This second Spanish vessel proved too much of a challenge for Rogers' 3 modest ships.
Malcolm? Oh, no, okay.
Yes.
Sorry about that. No, that's fine. Sorry.
Okay, that's great. I was just moving the slide on, sorry.
Okay.
He wrote, "To give the enemy their due, they defended themselves very well, but we might as well have fought against a castle of 50 guns, as this ship, which had about 40, and some of the prisoners told us 600 men, whereas of 150 were Europeans, many of them English and Irish, some of which had formerly been pirates." And that's Woodes Rogers pictured on the right of that picture when he was the governor of the Bahamas. Rogers' testimony from a privateering fleet with its own significant Irish contingent provides a tantalising glimpse of the Irish presence in the early Pacific Ocean. And it's worth remarking that on Rogers' own ships, there was a very large Irish component, that he had refitted his ships in Ireland before engaging on his international trip. In addition to the participation in Spanish exploration, Irish sailors also served in the Dutch East India Company, plying their trade from the vibrant port of Batavia to the neighbouring ports of East and Southeast Asia. Once again, current research on their numbers and backgrounds is scarce, although one, John Mara, has attracted significant interest from historians. Like so many others before him and after him who ventured to the Pacific, Mara's journey was a circuitous one. He was recruited by Captain James Cook to sail on the Endeavour when the ship called at Batavia in December 1770 for refitting. Mara was a welcome recruit to the British expedition at this stage of the passage, an experienced mariner who had served extensively on the ships of the VOC. As Cook would later testify, Mara was an Irishman by birth, a good seaman, and had sailed both in English and Dutch service. Cook's patience later wore thin when Mara repeatedly proved difficult to discipline on board. Mara later published his own unauthorised account of sailing with the venerated navigator Cook. British naval activity did the most to draw the Irish to this oceanic space. When the Royal Navy renewed its interest in the Pacific Ocean in the 1760s, the Irish sailed with it. Recent scholarship has shown British dependence on the Irish for military manpower in the 1780s onward. Protestant Irish had long been participants in the far-reaching activities of the East India Company, and Catholic and Protestant Irish together had left footprints in English colonising in the Caribbean and on the Atlantic fringes. However, the scale of Irish involvement in British overseas activities increased massively towards the end of the 18th century. High levels of recruitment of officers and enlisted men for military service took place, encouraged by measures that included the use of the Gaelic language, in advertising in the west of Ireland. Katrina Kennedy's study of Irish soldiering estimates that by 1813, Irish men, both Roman Catholic and Protestant, comprised fully 1/3 of the British Army's strength. While more and more Irish men enlisted in the British Army in the years following the French Revolution, active recruitment for the senior service, the Royal Navy, also rose to unprecedented levels. For example, in 1797-1798, the Royal Navy recruited 8.3% of its 120,000 seamen in Ireland, principally from the south and east of Ireland. By century's end, approximately 1 in 6 of the Royal Marines were of Irish birth, this despite proscriptions on Irish recruitment into that branch of the service that survived until the 1810s. In short, in the years on either side of the Act of Union of 1801, Britain's unquenchable thirst for military manpower proved increasingly dependent on tapping into the fast increasing number of Irish-born men seeking employment, adventure, and escape from the constraints of Irish life in the decades prior to the famine. And there were Irish present on those voyages of exploration, including on Captain Samuel Wallace's arrival in Tahiti on the ship Dolphin. While naval activity and trading companies provided critical stimulus for the Irish presence in the Pacific world, a range of other factors explain its expansion and reinforcement over time. In 1788, 18 years after Cook set foot on the Australian east coast at Botany Bay, a penal colony was established at New South Wales. Strategic concerns, commercial motives, the desire to procure raw materials for the Royal Navy, and the necessity of finding a solution to criminal overcrowding in British prisons have all featured among historians' explanations for the decision in 1787 to proceed with the new penal settlement. In the subsequent 50 years, in excess of 50,000 Irish convicts were transported to Australia, most directly from Ireland, but a minority following conviction in English courts. The prisoners range from United Irish followers sentenced after the 1798 uprising to agrarian protesters seeking to turn back the clock on commercialisation of the Irish economy. Others were common criminals guilty of violence or theft. And they brought their own particular spirit to the Australian colonies, including their participation in the convict rebellion at Castle Hill in New South Wales. Over time, the Irish convicts dispersed, lawfully or not. The majority remained in Australia at the completion of their period of servitude, taking up landholdings of various sizes, working as agricultural labourers, or finding employment in a range of occupations as towns and small rural settlements took shape across the country. More dramatically, others escaped from captivity, finding their way by sea to New Guinea, Fiji, Tonga, and New Zealand, among various destinations. Some of these fugitives show up in the historical record, including Morgan Bryan, who, heavily tattooed and crudely spoken, met the first London Missionary Society members who arrived on the island of Tongatapu in 1800, and Paddy Connell, an Irish fugitive who claimed to have fought with the French at Kinsale in 1798 and who was living in Fiji in the 1830s when the United States exploring expedition arrived at those islands. Irish men and women of this kind, restless, shadowy, elusive, appear fleetingly throughout the Pacific world in the first half of the 19th century. As the eminent Pacific historian Greg Denning reminded us of the early European population in the Marquesas Islands, for the most part, the stories of these beachcombers cannot be told. There are only the names of the ships they left, perhaps a moment of notoriety when they died, or a moment of usefulness when they organised a trade. From the frigid coast of Nootka Sound in the eastern Pacific Ocean, where the fur trade gradually developed in the late 18th century, to the inviting Hawaiian Islands, in the Galapagos Islands, the Marquesas, and in the island groups in the Northern Pacific, Irish people appeared as beachcombers, shipwrecked or abandoned seamen, traders, and sojourners. Some stayed for lengthy periods, attracted by the novelty of life, by adventure, sexual and romantic connections, or to escape justice. Others lived briefly on the Pacific shores before returning to new lives in California or Australia or in New Zealand. If a large group of late 18th and early 19th century Irish are near invisible in the historical record, others left indelible marks. Irishmen took positions of influence wherever British colonial activity spread throughout the Pacific. In India and East Asia, they numbered among the ranks of colonial functionaries who asserted European power. In New Zealand and Australia, they served as governors, magistrates, and colonial officers. For example, Waterford-born William Hobson, pictured here on the right, portraited on the right, was appointed the first governor of New Zealand, the man on whose watch the fledgling colony was organised into 3 Irish-named provinces, New Ulster, New Munster, and New Leinster, and 2 of the seals of those provinces are pictured on the left. Though these names did not long survive, their presence serves as a metaphor for Ireland's influence in the Pacific's past. The tendency towards Irish political and civic contribution increased further after the achievement of Roman Catholic emancipation in the United Kingdom in 1829, and continued to be a feature of life across large parts of the Pacific well into the 20th century. Religion was another important factor that drew the Irish to the Pacific. Given the fervour of Protestant evangelicalism and its development at the end of the 18th century in Britain, it did not take long for leaders of the Church in Britain and Ireland to identify the newly encountered islands of the Pacific as an area of high priority. The Evangelical magazine, published from 1793, provided its readers with up-to-date information about missionary activity across the globe and possibilities for missionary activity in what it frequently termed the South Sea Islands. The magazine's 1795 issue opened with a letter from a leading evangelical, the Reverend Thomas Hoyce, entitled The Very Probable Success of a Proper Mission to the South Seas. Hoyce's prospectus identified the alleged religious deficiencies of the inhabitants of the islands of the Pacific as offering evangelicals the prospect of major achievements. As he wrote, "No other part of the heathen world affords so promising a field for Christian mission, where the temper of the people, the climate, the abundance of food, and the easy collection of a number together for instruction bespeak the field ripe for harvest." With the evangelical awakening then underway in Ireland, a number of skilled and committed Irish Christians were ready to answer the Missionary Society's call for volunteers. The first to go was a Sligo-born carpenter, William Henry, who sailed with his wife on the missionary ship Duff on its first voyage in 1796. He landed in Tonga. While Protestantism dominated in Britain's Pacific territories, Roman Catholicism was also actively promoted, particularly in areas of French control. Irish priests, including men trained in France, soon arrived to undertake missionary work. Father Patrick Short, who sailed from Bordeaux on the ship Cornet to Honolulu on the 17th of November 1826, went to the Pacific following Pope Leo XII's appointment of an apostolic prefect for those islands. Another French-trained Irish priest, Robert Walsh, arrived in the same islands by ship from Valparaiso in Chile in September 1836, prompting tensions between the British consul and French naval officers. Catholic missions were also established in Melanesia and Micronesia. And this is a picture of the Missionary Society missions arriving in Tahiti, part of that first group. Trade was one additional field in which the Irish made their mark from the late 18th century. Best remembered is Peter Dillon, who was born in Martinique on the 15th of June 1788, the son of an Irish-born military officer from County Meath, who served in the French army on the Caribbean island. Dillon was educated in Ireland and reputedly joined the Royal Navy, serving at the Battle of Trafalgar. In 1806, he appeared in Calcutta, India, serving on the Irish navigator Anthony Burnside's ship as it traded its way along the line of islands and from India to Sumatra. Dillon's biographer captures the fragmentary nature of his subject's story in these early decades. His movement from shore to sea, sea to shore, from trader to navigator, beachcomber to anthropologist, always moving, always in motion. In 1808, he was aboard a ship arriving in Fiji in search of the precious commodity sandalwood, the quest for which destabilised island communities. And certainly Dillon was a contributor to that. From civil strife in Fiji, Dillon then sailed to Sydney, gaining a berth out of that port with another India-Irish hand, Thomas Reeby, owner of the ship Mercury. Dillon was aboard the Mercury when it sailed on the 17th of October 1809 for New Zealand's Bay of Islands, the victualling station for ships en route to Tahiti and the lucrative pork trade. Dillon's path took him to Van Diemen's Land, then back to Sydney, where he married, before returning to India. Peter Dillon's trans-Pacific movements are too complex to chart in their entirety. Key movements are indicative. In 1819, he purchased a first ship of his own, the St. Michael. It was sold the following year in favour of a larger ship, the 259-ton ship Calder, with the intention of opening trade with South America. Eventually, in January 1824, Dillon and his new purchase reached Chile, loaded in part with a cargo of New Zealand Cowrie masts and spars. Dillon also purchased a second ship, fittingly the St. Patrick, in Valparaiso, in partnership with a local merchant. Registered in Chile to Don Pedro Dillon, the St. Patrick proudly boasted an enormous green flag with a yellow Irish harp in it, as it traded as a merchantman in the South Pacific. Interested in the disappearance of the French navigator La Pérouse, Dillon's research on La Pérouse led him to Paris. As his biographer notes, the French government granted him an annuity for life in 1829 and an award for his service in seeking out La Pérouse. Subsequently, Dillon published extensively on the Pacific, arguing for the expansion of Roman Catholic missions and for French commerce in the Pacific, and he was commissioned as a consul for France. The historian Katrina Gulliver has proposed that there's a period of approximately 150 years, from the 1770s to World War II, in which a coherent Pacific world can be identified. For Gulliver, this Pacific era is characterised by what she described as a philosophical and cultural consciousness of the Pacific, as demonstrated by trade, cultural connections, and a deliberate international affiliation based on a sense of shared identity through Pacific location. The high point of this period of Pacific identity occurred in the decades following gold's discovery, when new and complex circuits were laid down across this oceanic space. A space that the American historian H. Bancroft later termed the New Pacific, and he wrote a book with that title. Prior to the 1850s, the geographic reach of Europeans across the Pacific was very wide. Western political and economic influence was increasingly powerful, but their numerical presence was remarkably small. At best estimate, on the eve of gold's discovery, those of Irish birth constituted somewhere between 40 and 50,000 of the total European population present in this oceanic space. The opening of the Pacific's goldfields changed this situation quickly and irreversibly. At the time of gold's finding near Sutter's Fort in 1848, California was a territory of scarcely 14,000 people, ruled over by the United States Army. Its population rose quickly once word of the precious metals presence spread, rising more than fivefold to 93,000 people in the space of only 2 years. Most of that growth was concentrated in San Francisco, a trading hamlet that in 1848 had a population of approximately 1,000, but which by 1856 grew into a bustling settlement of 56,000 people. Newcomers came to America's Golden City from all parts, including a significant wave of migration from southern China. New arrivals, invariably optimistic and frequently ill-prepared, arrived in California in search of immediate fortunes. A sizable Irish inflow contributed to this stream of hopeful gold seekers, and San Francisco retained a large Irish population even when the initial gold frenzy diminished. Despite its coincidence with Ireland's Great Famine, few people from Ireland travelled directly to California. Most came from elsewhere in North America or from Australasia. In fact, by 1870, the Irish-born had grown to be the largest overseas-born group in California, accounting for a quarter of all foreign-born residents in the state and about 10% of its total population. Gold finds in eastern Australia soon followed, producing a similar surge in immigration. The mesmerising discoveries in the colonies of New South Wales and Victoria in 1851 preceded by a decade the discovery of gold in southern New Zealand in May 1861. Other finds followed in dozens of hitherto unknown and sometimes forgotten places, scattered on either side of the Pacific Ocean. These included the west coast of New Zealand's South Island and near the town of Thames on the east coast of the North Island in the 1860s, at the tellingly named hamlet of Home Rule in central New South Wales in the early 1870s, near Charters Towers and Palmer River in Queensland during the same decade, and at the Canadian Yukon's Klondike in 1896. In these cases and countless others, gold discoveries initiated spasms of economic activity that became signal points in their respective local history and in their wider national historiographies. They also proved critical in moulding European minds about a more coherent and interconnected Pacific Anglo world, a spatial zone in which the Irish quickly became central participants. The migration of newcomers from Europe and East Asia in the fast-growing societies on the eastern and western shores of the Pacific Ocean was matched by a new transoceanic mobility, a development aided by a dramatic increase in the size of the United States merchant fleet and the arrival of new steamships capable of venturing far from coastal waters. American shipbuilders launched 125 new ocean clippers in 1853 alone, enabling an exponential increase in the number of trans-Pacific crossings. For example, where only 3 New England-based ships made port in Melbourne in 1851, 2 years later that number had risen to 134. Lumber, prefabricated houses and consumer items from American mills and factories flooded into Melbourne to meet the needs of the eager newcomers who stepped ashore on the city's docks each day. New technology revolutionised the speed and reliability of Pacific travel. State-of-the-art sailing vessels took weeks off the length of the journey, and the replacement of sail power with steam engines proved even further reductions in the time and greater regularity in service. Eventually, on the 23rd of April 1853, the 1,000-ton American cruise steamer Monumental City arrived in Sydney from San Francisco via Tahiti, carrying 124 steerage-class passengers, becoming the first steamship to cross the Pacific Ocean. The steamer's voyage time from California was 65 days. It was followed soon after by a large steamer, the New Orleans. Fast economic growth on the Pacific's perimeter profoundly affected life in the ocean's interior. In the 1870s, the expansion and integration of Pacific Island communities into wider regional and global trading networks continued apace. Ships took on fresh fuel and provisions in the principal ports of Honolulu, Levuka, and Apia, where the impact of the Pacific Islands' incorporation into the 19th century capitalist economy was evident in multiple ways. For example, in Hawaii, the second half of the 19th century saw the expansion of the sugar industry, built upon the importation of large numbers of indentured labourers from China and Japan. In Fiji, the 1870s saw the arrival of new European settlers determined to profit from small-scale cotton production. Though declining world cotton prices and natural disasters decimated that fledgling industry, financial institutions were established and new economic commercial activities developed. The Fiji Banking Commercial Company opened its doors in 1873, with New Zealand entrepreneurs taking a keen interest in economic opportunities there. From 1880, the arrival of the powerful colonial sugar refining company transformed sugar production in Fiji. There, as in all the islands, Irish were present across the social spectrum and in a range of professions, occupations, and roles, sometimes as long-term residents, at other times as short-term sojourners. Irish identity throughout this Pacific Ocean was never uniform or unified. Geographic and family origins, gender, religion, class, political outlook, place of settlement, each contributed to multifaceted identities and complex community relations wherever the Irish settled down. Two of the most significant factors in the making of Irish individual and community identities were religion and support for Irish national aspirations. In the case of religion, the mid-19th century intensification of Irish Catholicism contributed to the growth and maintenance of Pan-Pacific Irish identity. A key contributor was the worldwide spread of Irish missionary priests following Ireland's Synod of Thurles. Ireland's desperate mid-19th century famine and Cardinal Paul Cullen's devotional revolution ensured there was a large number of missionary priests and members of religious orders committed to support Irish Catholic communities abroad. All Hallows College at Drumcondra, established in 1842, proved particularly influential in staffing the church in the Pacific. In 1850, the college had 90 students undergoing preparation for appointment to 25 overseas missions. By 1860, that number had more than doubled. 210 students were in training for overseas postings. Dioceses on either side of the Pacific figured prominently among the destinations for these students. 46 priests were earmarked for Australian destinations, Sydney 19, Melbourne 13, Brisbane 7, Hobart 5, 2 for Perth, with another assigned to the Auckland Diocese in New Zealand. United States West Coast Diocese received a further 19, principally San Francisco, which received 15. 6 more were destined for India. This scale of recruitment for overseas posts continued in the next decade. In fact, of 279 ordinations at All Hallows between 1866 and 1872, a completion rate of 72% of all students who enrolled for priestly training. A total of 74 priests, or 27%, were sent to Australasia, while the United States West Coast Diocese, including Vancouver Island, received a further 36 priests, or 13%. In the late 19th century, bishops in 3 dioceses, San Francisco and Bathurst and Perth in Australia, were products of All Hallows College. Personal ties between All Hallows alumni proved crucial in the establishment and content setting of Roman Catholic newspapers in the Pacific, as well as the exchange of religious news that shaped how Irish readers understood their position in a worldwide diaspora. A detailed study of the Dunedin-based New Zealand tablet, edited from 1898 until 1910 by Henry William Cleary, shows the extent to which that newspaper was integrated into circuits of information that bypassed Ireland and derived meaning in the distinctive Pacific space. Cleary, who was born in Wexford in 1859, studied in Dublin and Rome before immigrating to undertake parish work in Victoria. His writing challenging Australian Protestantism attracted a lot of attention and led to his appointment as the editor of the New Zealand Tablet. From his new post in New Zealand South, Cleary wrote to the Bishop of Ballarat, All Hallows alumnus James Moore, explaining his many connections with fellow newspaper editors. He wrote, "An old Maynooth confrere of mine is doing good work as editor of the Tasmanian Monitor. An old schoolmate of mine is in St Peters. Reverend W.B. Kelly edits the WA Record in succession to the present Archbishop of Adelaide, and Cardinal Moran is editor-in-chief of the Australasian Catholic Record." Cleary either subscribed to or engaged in exchanges or periodically sent clippings to Irish newspapers based right around the Pacific, including Melbourne's Advocate, the Sydney Freeman's Journal, and the principal West Coast American newspaper, the San Francisco Monitor. These exchanges consolidated the religiously self-aware Irish Pacific community, generating a shared sense of identity. The task of hibernicizing the Catholic Irish in the Pacific world extended beyond the priesthood. Orders of religious nuns and lay brothers came close in the wake of the Irish bishops, ready to deepen the Irish religious presence in the communal life of the people and to fulfill the critical role of educating young second and third generation children into the cultural world of the Irish Catholic Church. The different groups of legion and the extent of their presence and role varied from place to place. The large increase in the number of religious women in the post-famine years saw frequent calls made on Irish nuns to staff schools and support hospitals. Lay orders, including the Christian Brothers, also staffed schools on either side of the Pacific and in numerous communities. And we saw something of this in the excellent documentary yesterday. Other orders, including the Maris, founded in France, increasingly drew on recruits of Irish descent in their seminaries and colleges around the world. Maris schools opened in Samoa and Fiji in the late 19th century and continue to this day. Historian Patrick O'Farrell reported from personal experience the obsessiveness towards Ireland of a New Zealand Irish-born Maris brother, Brother Egbert, who through the first half of the 20th century used Latin classes to teach Irish history and literature to his Catholic charges. Equally colourful was the career of Brother Patrick Thompson. Born in Australia in 1921 of Irish grandparents, this Maris brother described himself as naturally steeped in Irish history and culture. Stationed on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands in the early 1970s, Brother Patrick published poems in Pidgin honouring St Patrick, set to Irish tunes. It's also the case that there's a Protestant Irish side to this particular theme. However, I'll go on and talk about Irish nationalism. Irish nationalism proved to be another key driver in the development and maintenance of Irish identity. From the 1880s, a string of prominent Irish nationalist leaders visited the Pacific world to gain moral and financial support for Ireland's Home Rule campaign. John and William Redmond, John Dillon, Thomas Esmond and Michael Davitt feature among the cast of leaders who campaigned enthusiastically on Ireland's behalf. And that's, of course, John Redmond on the left, and on the right, a picture taken by Michael Davitt in Samoa. He was an enthusiastic photographer. In addition to visiting specific Irish communities, several of these visits served as a bridge to the Pacific and connected Irish communities in America and Australasia. They also connected Irish claims for self-determination with the aspiration of Pacific peoples. Following their 1889 tour of Australia, the delegation of Dillon, Esmond and John Deasy were keen to familiarise themselves with Pacific issues as they travelled to the United States. Thomas Esmond went ahead of the party and left the most extensive written record. Opting for a rudimentary bunk on a Western Pacific tradie ship, Esmond met the ageing King George Tupou I of Tonga, who knew of the Irish leader Parnell and his impact on British politics. Esmond met other Irishmen in the expatriate population there. One, a native of County Mayo, was a firm home ruler and donated £5 on the spot to evicted tenants in Ireland. The other expatriate was a Dubliner who made his living trading trinkets. Esmond's next stop was German colonised Samoa, where the local newspaper editor was a Dubliner who confronted the similar challenge of the threat of censorship from a colonial administration unsympathetic to a free press. Esmond's account of Pacific crossing demonstrates he took a keen interest in the island communities he visited. His memoir contains wide-ranging comment on matters including housing, local politics, Indigenous customs and language. Across all of these islands, the shadow of colonialism loomed large. Esmond wrote critically about German colonial policy and did not disguise his bitterness over England's complicity in the spread of European imperialism in the Pacific. Unsurprisingly, he showed concern and sympathy for the plight of people oppressed by the European powers, but his account also showed unmistakable condescension towards the island population and their capacity for self-rule. Esmond drew a firm distinction between Ireland's preparedness for home rule and the readiness of the people of the Pacific for self-government. So to start to wind up, in addressing the historical presence of the Irish in the Pacific world, one important group is unrecorded in the census enumerations and has received insufficient attention from historians, though fortunately are getting discussed in this conference. Throughout the Pacific, the Irish legacy is visible in thousands of men, women and children who are descendants of mixed Irish Indigenous parentage and who identify their Irish heritage as an important part of their genealogy. Noteworthy studies in recent years have begun to excavate the complex history of intimate encounters and interracial relationships between the Indigenous populations of the Pacific and those who came from afar. For the progeny of those relationships, Irish inheritance is present and transmitted in their family stories, sometimes in religious affiliation and occasionally by a sense of Ireland as a synonymous culture. For younger generations, a visit to Ireland may commemorate their Irish ancestry. Scholars in New Zealand, Australia, the American West and the Pacific Islands are increasingly aware of these people whose Irish story remains one of the least investigated aspects of the Irish diaspora. The case of the Indigenous elder and Australian national political figure Pat Dodson offers a glimpse into this largely hidden island. Dodson's maternal grandmother's father, Joseph Fagan, was a native of County Monaghan Island. Joe Fagan arrived in Australia in 1857 as an infant with his parents, John and Matilda Fagan. The Presbyterian family arrived in Victoria and quickly commenced agricultural work on land near Geelong, while their son acquired the critical skills and vices of the Australian bush. By 1887, Joe Fagan was living thousands of miles to the north as the head stockman at the Victoria River Downs in Queensland, then the world's largest cattle station. Following in the tracks of the famous Durack family and its celebrated multi-generation migration from southeastern Australia to the Kimberley region, Joe Fagan headed west across the continent in pursuit of gold. In Western Australia, he took stock work at the celebrated Wave Hill station, where in 1898 he fathered a daughter, Elizabeth Grace Fagan, in a long-term relationship with an Indigenous woman, Nawela. In 2000, Pat Dodson travelled to Ireland to participate in a conference on reconciliation. He's spoken warmly of his stay there, of the places he visited, identities discovered, connections made, and of the importance of his own Irish history in thinking about the challenges of Indigenous people in post-colonial Australia. Acknowledging these shared pasts is, I think, the greatest challenge facing the Irish diaspora and those who study it today. It's also one of the most urgent. The Irish government's document, Global Irish Islands Diaspora Strategy 2020 to 2025, presents an ambitious forward-looking approach to the Irish state's engagement with the Irish diaspora. Emphasising values including commitment to ensure the welfare of the Irish abroad remains at the heart of our diaspora support, the government strategy extends its reach broadly to include Irish citizens living overseas, both those born in Ireland and those born abroad to Irish families, as well as the heritage diaspora, those many millions of people of Irish descent around the world. This commitment to the welfare of the Irish diaspora is a large and significant responsibility in the current world where issues of sustainability confront the globe and the future of life on this planet is at issue. We participate in this conference on Celtic connections with the Pacific world, conscious that our existential environmental crisis is expected to increase dramatically the number of persons globally in need of resettlement, with estimates of up to 200 million people likely to be displaced later in this century. We are aware, too, that the islands of the Pacific stand as landmasses amongst the most susceptible to the effects of climate change and rising ocean levels. It's entirely appropriate that we consider and reconsider questions of Irish identity and the Pacific world's connection with Ireland. Where historically the Pacific received and provided opportunities for hundreds of thousands of unsettled or displaced Irish migrants after 1788, we should pose questions about Ireland's ethical obligations to this region's future, and in particular to the thousands of members of its Irish heritage diaspora likely to feel distress in the coming decades. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malcolm, for this brilliant talk, as usual. Are there any questions? So I have two questions regarding New Caledonia, as you can imagine, the Irish in New Caledonia. So in your research, have you come across Irish settling in New Caledonia? And can you tell us a bit more about that from your perspective?
Sure. And I'd have to say that I think, Naomi, that you probably know much more about this topic than I do, so I will be modest. But to say it's really important, I think, to think about the expansion that occurred in the early part of the 19th century. And one of the things that interests me is the ways in which trading networks run initially by the East India Company extended into the Western Pacific. And there's no doubt, I think, about the extent to which there were early Irish connections, say, through the East India Company with New Caledonia. But what one of the great and urgent research tasks really, I think, is to go back and try and unpick those expanding trade networks, particularly in the early part of the 19th century. And I would say that's a wonderful topic for prospective postgraduate students in the future to be thinking about the ways in which those connections developed over time, because they've never been adequately explored, and certainly I haven't been able to adequately do that. But I think that would be a really rich vein in terms of looking at the early 19th century. And then one sees, I think, some similar patterns to what occurs in other parts of the Pacific later in the century. But definitely this is a very rich topic for further exploration.
Thank you. Question? So I have another question again about New Caledonia. In the second half of the 19th century, were there ships connecting New Zealand and New Caledonia?
Oh, that I honestly don't know the answer to that question.
Okay. It's wondering. And that's come across it in my research.
Yeah, I don't know, but that's something actually I should get a postgraduate student to be doing some work on.
Okay, good. That's a good idea.
and I'd be really happy to try and do more research on that direction. So New Zealand was in the same way that New Zealand still maintains very strong Pacific connections. That is evident in the second half of the 19th century generally, and in particular, for example, I know there's been work done on the development of financial institutions in Fiji, and the way in which Irish merchants, New Zealand merchants, including those of Irish descent, were involved in the development of institutions, say in Fiji. And looking at the Pacific in a slightly broader sense would be, I think, a really important thing for someone to do in the future. So I'm sorry I don't have a definite answer to your question, but it's a really good one, and would be, I think, a really rich area for future scholarship.
That's good. It's a new project then.
Yes.
So any other questions? So thank you very much, Malcolm. Are there any questions? Sorry. I didn't see you, sorry.
Thank you for your presentation. I had a question about Irish identity and how they reflect, well, is there a way the Irish in the Pacific reflect their identity today?
Sorry, could you just repeat the last part of the question?
Is there a way Irish people in the Pacific reflect their identity today?
Sure, it's a great question. I think I'm going to sound like I'm not answering your question. I think when I say that there's no one way in which Irish identity is reflected in the Pacific. So I think my own view on this is that there's a very sort of conventional view of Irish identity that maybe has developed over a long historical time that's centred largely on religion and on connections with the past and on family identity. But I think that that's been affected very much by, say, more recent generations of Irish migration that's occurred in the 21st century, where people are leaving a very different homeland from those who's left in the 19th century, and where families might have treasured stories from the past. And the other really important dimension, which I tried to touch on in the end of my talk, is this, I think, long hidden history of the heritage diaspora, of those who have familial connections in the past, and where Irish identity is very important, but where there's not been much recognition, I think, on the part of either the Irish government or historians about their presence, their role, their identity. And so I think recognising that sense of diversity is really one of the key challenges. And just to make a comment about the Irish government's diaspora strategy, I think this is also a laudable thing. I think Ireland recognises the benefits for itself from adopting a strategy that embraces a very wide diaspora, including what it terms the heritage diaspora, the Irish in the Caribbean, those of African American descent, and so on. I think this is a good thing to do, but I do wonder whether there's an adequate recognition in the words about what that really means, about the size, the scale of that diaspora, and whether there are ethical implications when you reach out to that group. And I think this is a really important question for the future. Can I just add one quick comment too? I noticed Kira's excellent presentation last night, and I realised when she was delivering it that my PowerPoint had exactly the same background. And I don't know what the odds are of choosing randomly the same two PowerPoint backgrounds, but just luck.
Hello, Malcolm. Thank you very much for your talk. I have a very naive question. I know that in South America, for example, there is you can claim for like Italian citizenship if you can prove that in your ancestors there was some Italian people moving to South America. Is there something similar allowed by the Irish government?
That's a very good question, and there might be someone else in the audience who is an Irish citizen who is better able to answer this. So I'm not an Irish citizen, and while I have some Irish ancestry on my mother's side, I'm not an Irish citizen. So I don't think my understanding would be that Ireland requires more than that sense of a quite distant familial connection in terms of citizenship. That something much more and closer is needed. But it's an interesting question about the way in which Ireland engages with its diaspora. And there's been, of course, debates about the role that the Irish overseas should have, say, in presidential elections. It's where you draw the line and who should be considered still to be connected with the nation, I think, is a very important question. I think Ireland not maybe so loose as it sounds Italy is in parts of South America, but that's a continuing debate, I think, and one that might well raise its head again in the next 40 or 50 years as we confront the challenges of global warming and rising sea levels.
Any other?
This might be a bit of a broader question, but when you answered the question of Emma, I got very curious. After all your research, do you believe that there's an Irish identity in the Pacific that is different from the Irish identity in Ireland? Because I know that in New Caledonia, we have a French identity that is very, very different from the French identity in France.
Great question, and I think the answer is yes. And what are the characteristics of this Irish identity in the Pacific? Well, it seems to me that historically, let me try and answer it in this way. When historians have written about Irish migration, the sort of normative experience has been the Atlantic and the connections between Ireland and North America. And the emphasis there has been on, in most of the work, on the Irish as having difficulty adjusting to their new lives. Famously, a book by the American historian Kirby Miller talked about the Irish, having a sense of exile, a sense of lament, a sadness attached to their migration that affected their adjustment to American life. I think within the Pacific, what we see is much more a mood of adventure, a mood of optimism. I don't want to say that there were not impediments to Irish economic progress. I don't want to say it was there were never problems that confronted Irish, or that there was never discrimination, because all of those things existed. But it is true to say, I think, that there was a mood of optimism and adventure about the experience of being so far away from Ireland that characterised the Pacific in a general sense, that does make a distinctive identity. And I've tried to talk a little bit about that a little bit more in the book that was mentioned in the video at the beginning. And the Mick Maloney quote that began today's talk, where he goes on and talks about the characteristics of the Irish who put their feet in the Pacific Ocean. And I think he talks about them being adventurous people, people who took more risks, people who, because they were so far from home, because they recognised the challenges in the 19th century in living within the Pacific, ended up with a somewhat different view, a more optimistic view, I think. So this would be my general answer to that question.